Welcome to City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Greg McPherson, City Club President. For 100 years, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and explore. We're gathered at the Sentinel Hotel along with all of you listening or viewing on OPB, Portland Community Media, or YouTube. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. Our media partner is Oregon Business Magazine, and our current Friday Forum sponsors are Bank of the Cascades, Stoll Reeves LLP, Family Care, Russell Fellows Properties, and The Standard. An additional sponsor of this program is PacWest Communications. Soon, Oregonians may find themselves voting on what would be the largest tax increase in state history. Its new revenue would be devoted entirely to education, health care, and aid for seniors. Can Oregon businesses afford this $3 billion a year tax? Can Oregon workers afford to live without it? Every year, those in the state legislature have the daunting task of matching tax revenue with needed services. Today's guests, State Representative Peter Buckley and former State Representative Lane Shetterly, have significant experience balancing the many demands made upon our legislature. Moderating today's conversation is Nicole Marr, President of Northwest Health Foundation, a champion of advocacy, policy, and support to vulnerable populations. She serves on a number of governing boards, including the City Club of Portland and the National Comcast-NBC Joint Council Board. Nicole Marr was born in Ketchikan, Alaska, and is a member of the Tlingit tribe. She will introduce today's other guests. Please welcome them all to City Club.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. We'd like to actually start today by wishing City Club a happy birthday, as it is City Club's 100th birthday this year. I'm also excited and honored to introduce both of our panelists, both distinguished leaders for our state. So I'm going to introduce them both and then start with a broad question. Lane Shetterly is a partner in the law firm Shetterly, Irick, and Ozias, located in Dallas, Oregon, where he began his law practice in 1981. Mr. Shetterly served 7 years in the Oregon legislature before he left to become the director of the Oregon Department of Land Conservation. He serves on a variety of distinguished boards, and in his personal life, he's completed over 6 hood-to-coast relays. And an important fun tax fact about him is that he is the last Republican to chair a revenue committee for the legislature. Although he corrected me earlier saying he wasn't the last, he was just the most recent. Joining us on our panel today is Representative Peter Buckley, who represents South Jackson County. He has served since 2004, and he quickly rose to leadership in 2005 and has served in a variety of distinguished roles. Prior to that, he served for 22 years as an actor, writer, and producer, as well as a teacher. He has served under 4 speakers, 3 governors, and he claims he has good things to say about all of them. So today is a really important conversation, and it's really an opportunity to have a discussion about the complexities of Oregon's tax. Voters later may have the chance to weigh in on potentially the biggest tax increase in our state's history. Today's focus is really an examination of the complexities, controversies, and opportunities in Oregon's budget process. Today we ask the critical questions: do we spend too much? Do we tax too little? What could we be doing different and better? So to really kick it off, I'm going to invite both of you, really starting with former Representative Shetterly, to share with us about what you view the role of government to be. You both come from different parties, different perspectives, different parts of the state, and we'd really appreciate it if you would share your perspective on what the role of government is in Oregon and what you view a healthy tax structure to be to support that role.
Thank you. And, thank you, everyone, for the invitation to be here today. It's a pleasure to be back. It's been a few years since I was with you, but it's great to be here and see many friends, and have made some new ones already today. I think to begin with, the role of government, I hope that's not a controversial question or a controversial answer. I think we have fairly well scoped out here in Oregon the role of state government. It's really defined largely by our budget priorities, and those three priorities are in education, healthcare, and public safety, with then the array of other services that the government provides that are also supported by the budget. But I think in terms of the big picture, it's going to be those three. As former director of the Department of Land Conservation and Development, I would say that probably comes in a close fourth among the role of state priorities. But it really is to provide an environment that is conducive to a well-educated population, a healthy population, and an array of good, well-paying jobs to support individuals and families. That really boils down to that. That's a healthy environment, that's a healthy economy, and a variety of choices for people living in Oregon. So there's, in a very broad picture, I think, my sense of what's the role of government. Nothing too controversial, I hope, about that. In terms of our revenue system, I think we have two major issues. One is adequacy, the other is structure. And they really can't be divorced in my mind. I led, of course, having chaired the Revenue Committee for 4 years and served on it for 7 years, I spent some time getting grounded in our state tax system. In 2007, 2008, I chaired a task force on comprehensive revenue restructuring, where we took a very serious look and a comprehensive look at the revenue system. And what we decided was job number one in terms of attacking and improving our revenue system was not about adequacy, but it was about stability. And the recommendation that that task force made to the legislature that session was kicker reform to enable the development of an adequate rainy day fund. We have the Education Stability Fund in Oregon now that is partially there, and we're doing better than we were in 2008, but we're still not where we need to be to provide the stability that we need, because we have one of the most, and in some cases, in some years, the most volatile revenue system in the country, with revenues dropping sometimes more than 20% in a biennium. And when you have the kind of roller coaster effects that we have with our revenue system that is dependent primarily on the personal income tax and secondarily on corporate income tax, then you have a system that is very difficult, as Peter knows, to budget from one biennium to the next as those revenues fluctuate. And so we need to address adequacy so that we have some real challenges coming up with the Medicaid gap as the federal government recedes from its expansion of the Medicaid population. We know we have PERS on the horizon. There are some needs out there, but we can't lose track of the fact that we have an extremely volatile system, and that just adding more revenue to the system that we have will not solve the issue of stability, which is critical to going forward in the long term.
Representative Peter Buckley, will you share your response?
I'd be glad to. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Just a little perspective on how I approach this. My first campaign manager many years ago is someone who many of you might know, Ashley Henry. She now lives here and works in Portland. She made a comment about Ashland once, about my hometown. She said, Ashland is like 5 square miles of heaven surrounded by reality. And those of you who have been to Ashland, you understand what she was referring to. Those of you who haven't been to Ashland, you really should come down. So I have been Ashland's ambassador to reality for about a dozen years now. And I'm really happy to have the opportunity to be here today in Portland to deliver a report of what I've learned working in reality for about a dozen years in legislature and just about 8 years in the state budget process. And there's three things I would like to say. Many of the things that Lane said about the role of state government, I fully agree with. I think he framed that very well. But the 3 points I want to make this afternoon First is that our state budget is structurally deficient. It is a structurally deficient, not just the kicker in regards to our inability to build up reserves, but we have a structural deficiency in our ability to fund adequately. Number two, that structural deficiency was created by all of us as citizens, by the legislature, and by the PERS board as well. The main pieces, the main components of that deficiency are Measure 5, passed by the voters in 1990, and the creation, development, and mistakes made around the PERS system over the past close to 30 years. And to touch on those very, very briefly, when we passed Measure 5, we gave the responsibility for the K-12 system for our schools. We gave the primary responsibility to the state budget. And the implied promise was when the measure passed, we were doing a good thing. We're choosing to cap the increase of property taxes. And that proved to be a very, very good thing for homeowners throughout the state to try to make sure we understood what the increase in property taxes would be as we go forward. But in doing so, giving the primary responsibility for K-12 to the state budget, we did not provide the revenue that was promised to help pay for our schools. And for 25 years, we have not succeeded in resolving that issue. And we skated by a little bit in the 1990s when the economy was good and the impacts weren't hitting us face so hard. But in the early 2000s, when the recession hit then, the state really struggled to try to have a balanced budget. You guys, many of you were here, many of you lived through that, and we were not able to address it. And we started to show up in the panels of Doonesbury as having the shortest school year in the country, et cetera. And our K-12 system started to be disinvested in, and at the same time, in order to try to find a balance, we disinvested in higher education just to try to hold things together. The other major component, obviously, is PERS. And PERS is also a product of choice compounded by mistakes. The system was developed, I think, by making a very reasonable choice. In state agencies, in local governments and school districts in the 80s into the 90s, a deal was made with teachers and correction workers and state policemen. Hey, work for a lower salary in exchange for a better retirement package. That was the kind of deal that was made, and it was a legitimate choice. School districts were cash-strapped, even in the 80s and early 90s. And my neighbor, for instance, my next-door neighbor, he taught in Jackson County schools for 30 years. And when he first started, his salary was so low, his family was on food stamps the first 2 years of his teaching career. Now he has a pretty decent retirement. So that was a choice that was made by the state. Unfortunately, it was compounded by mistakes, not only by the legislature, by different tweaks that were done to the system going forward, but the major mistake was by the PERS board in the 1990s when the returns from the stock market came in, and instead of banking the returns over the 8% guaranteed rate of return, the PERS board decided to send those dollars out to their members' retirement packages, which was then compounded by the fact that there's a 2% COLA, cost of living adjustment, on those packages. So the system became totally unsustainable. And probably none of this is news to you folks, but there was the reform effort in the 90s to create Tier 2. In 2003, the very, very hard-fought reforms that developed the third tier, basically, of Osberg. And we thought we probably had the PERS system maybe stabilized, and we could start looking at these other factors, like how do we finally address the gap from Measure 5. And then the Great Recession hit. PERS lost 27% of its assets in 1 year. We made one more attempt to reform PERS in 2013, and last year the Supreme Court threw out that reform. So our budget is structurally deficient. And the message I need to send to you today, or at least I want to express to you today, is that unless we stand up and address those deficiencies, we are going to, in my view, violate a moral obligation we have to the next generation of Oregonians. And the other hard thing I need to say is that we can't address those deficiencies unless we raise more revenue.
Thank you both. So I'm going to move to asking you some questions. So these are going to be a little bit shorter responses. And I want to move the conversation locally. So both of you actually referenced Measure 5 and Measure 50. And I think many folks from all sides agree that Oregon is still reeling from the effects of Measure 5 or Measure 50. Despite what you think of how good or bad it is for Oregon cities, we can all agree that it has created serious inequities for property owners. Two houses that may be a few blocks from each other worth the same amount on the open market today may have wildly different tax bills based on simply what they were worth 25 years ago. Both the League of Oregon Cities and Association of Oregon Counties and a whole long list of other folks have proposed significant reforms to address these inequities. What is keeping the legislature from tackling this issue?
You want me to go first on this one? I'd be glad to. We've wrestled with this. The former legislators who are here today know that they wrestled with it. It comes up every session to wrestle with. Every time you delve into the property tax issues, there are so clear winners and losers in that. And there's multiple winners and there's multiple losers. And trying to fit together what the proposal will be that will adjust the property tax system in a way that can be seen as fair both to the people who are currently benefiting by the standards set in property tax and fair to the ones who are not. We have not been able to find that magic bullet. And then to be really a politician about this, and I am an outgoing politician, but to be a politician about this, when you poll any sort of proposal on property taxes, it sinks like a stone. Oregonians look at it, it's complex, they look where they are in the proposal and they say, hey, I'm a loser here, or I don't understand it, and we simply can't find that path to get that done. So that's my answer on that.
Do you want to add to that, Representative Shetterly?
Sure. Again, going back to the Task Force on Comprehensive Revenue Restructuring, we did look at the property tax system, and frankly, where we left property tax was with a almost footnotes at the end of the report of things that are wrong with it and that we should fix if we could. But the consensus was that the politics, and I don't mean just in the building, I mean the politics around the state, are such that that's a really steep hill to climb and not one that we recommended spending a lot of energy on, certainly back in 2007. That's a little bit dispiriting, but keep in mind that the Measure 5 and Measure 50 are both constitutional provisions, which means that any fundamental change in the property tax system is going to require a statewide vote to amend the Constitution. When that happens, keep in mind that amends Constitution goes in the ballot title, along with the words property tax, probably, and those four words seem to be the death knell of any measure. Very briefly, I will say, just a case in point, because I'm not making this up. If you recall, Measure 50 reverted to tax bases back to 1995, and that was the starting point for Measure 50. It was passed in 97, and it did that just because it was mimicking Measure 39, never mind. But anyway, as it worked out, it turned out that on the date that we fixed for the permanent tax bases under Measure 50, that was the date that a district in Deschutes County, I want to say it was the sheriff's levy, went off. And so the sheriff got stuck with a zero tax base. And so that was an oversight. Nobody intended that to be the case. We went back a couple of years later with an amendment to basically restore a tax base to that levy in Deschutes County, but because it was in Measure 50, it required a statewide vote. We thought, what's the problem with this? It's fixing a very local problem. I think that measure went down about 70 to 30. The voters wouldn't even support an amendment to restore a tax base to a single taxing district. As a consequence, that's probably about all I'm going to have to say about property taxes this noon. If somebody wants to order the beer and pizza, we can talk longer. But I just don't think that's going to be a very productive conversation for reforming our tax system today. Maybe we'll get there someday, but I'm not optimistic about it now.
For our listeners on OPB, my name is Nicole Maher, and I serve as the president of Northwest Health Foundation, and I'm joined at the City Club Friday Forum with Representative Peter Buckley and former Representative Lane Shetterly. So now I want to move on to a question about who pays what share in Oregon of our taxes. So in 1975, corporations paid 18.5% of Oregon's total tax bill. That number fell to about 6.4% this biennium. That essentially means we as a state are expressing our values by saying that individuals should pay a much greater share. Do you think that's the right mix? And actually, let's start with you, former Representative Shetterly.
Well, thank you, Nicole. The numbers have changed. I guess what I don't know, and I will confess to being inexpert is what is the right balance. Keep in mind, of course, and it sounds like a campaign slogan, but it is it is fundamentally true that corporations pass their tax burden on to investors, shareholders, to labor, or to consumers. And so it's a little bit simplistic to say that we want to tax corporations more and reduce the burden on individuals, because in fact so much of that burden actually gets passed through. In my mind, again, the issue is not so much the balance, but the overall burden on taxpayers generally, and it goes back again to our dependence on the income tax, and a system that would be better with, that would be a diversified system that isn't focused on whether we're taxing individuals or corporations, but rather is looking at a diversified base of taxes generally, and spreading the burden that way, and in doing that, increasing the collection of revenue as well.
So this is it's a crucial issue, and there's no tax that doesn't impact all of us in some manner. I mean, if you look at the property tax issue, it impacts all of us in some manner. There have been proposals on sales tax, which would, of course, impact everyone, and Oregonians have been very, very firm about not wanting to go there. But if you do look at our corporate tax, if you look at the revenue that is coming into the state, and you're looking at where that revenue is coming from, and you look at the balance of our system, I think you do have to look towards corporate taxation. We are, by many studies, a low corporate tax state. And I think one of the things we need to do, we need to actually address, is that we can choose to continue to be a low corporate tax state, but by making that choice, we're choosing to be the 46th, 47th state investments in higher education. I think we need to make a change on that.
So let's take a minute and talk about what we spend money on in Oregon. So nationally, there's a significant movement around criminal justice reform. Our neighbors in California have passed sweeping reforms around criminal justice, and it's actually one of the only things Congress is working together on in a bipartisan way to make changes, really with this deep belief that it is not maybe the best thing to spend money on and the costs are only going up. With that said, Oregon has not made any real reforms in this area, and when you look at the share of our budget going to those costs, it's significantly increasing. How does our approach to public safety factor into our long-term state budget? And I'm going to ask you, Representative Buckley, to begin.
It has an impact, and I didn't mention Measure 11 as one of the structural deficiencies in our state budget process, but that did mandate sentencing, and it has led to a greater cost in incarceration. However, I disagree with your question somewhat. We've done a lot of work in regard to trying to address the cost of incarceration, the changing of sentencing where we can, where it's not mandated by the voters. We have made changes. Those were bitter conversations in the legislature. Many of my colleagues who voted for sentencing reform had incredibly emotional, destructive campaigns run against them, calling them friends of sexual predators, things along that line. So we have engaged. The Pew Institute came to the state of Oregon several years back. The Kulongoski administration's Reset Committee had pushed on this issue. The legislature responded. We worked with the Pew Institute. We looked at the cost in the public safety system. We looked for sentencing reform, but we also looked in terms of what's our use of mental health dollars, what's our use of drug and alcohol dollars, how can we divert people out of the prison pipeline. We've been successful. We were projected to build yet another prison in Lane County. We've been able to pull back and not build that prison, but our prison population is still too high, and I fully agree with you. There's more work to be done, but I would disagree that we have not engaged.
But is the premise that the overall costs of our justice system is going up in the next several years, or is that untrue?
No, I think the projection is that it'll continue to increase, and the Community Justice Investment Grant Program is a program that we put in place to try to give resources at the local level to divert. If that program starts showing success, we can start pulling down the cost of the public safety system. However, in the public safety system, we need to acknowledge we are underfunding the system as a whole. The judges, our judicial salaries for our state are amongst the lowest in the country. Our payment to public defenders amongst the lowest in the country.
Thank you for that. Do you want to add a short comment?
Sure. Representative Buckley mentioned the Governor Kulongoski's Reset Committee. I want to confess I was on that as well. And so if you read that report and the report of the Comprehensive Task Force, Revenue Task Force, you'll find all the answers to these questions. They're there. Nobody's adopted them yet. If I can, just very briefly, Nicole, in the first three questions that have come up, we've referred to Measure 11, Measure 50, and Measure 5, and 49 came up, or 39 came up in mine. 49. What that tells me is another thing that we looked at in our Revenue Restructuring Committee, that part of our problem and our structural problem in Oregon is the initiative process. In the Legislative Assembly, when I want to spend money as a legislator, I have to go get that money from Peter's committee. And then the budget has to balance before we go home. Through the legislative process, we have the magic of being able to imagine programs that we either want to implement or tax cuts that we want to enjoy without having to deal with the other side of that ledger. And so really and truly, much of, I think, where we find ourselves today in very many significant areas is a consequence of that initiative process that doesn't regard the balance that you have in the Ways and Means process in the legislature.
Great. So one more question for you. According to our most recent census, a quarter of Oregon adults or taxpayers are people of color, and yet 92% of our legislature are white. Wouldn't you think that that is considered taxation without representation?
Let me apologize. Let me apologize to the radio audience for that dead air. I would hope not. I would hope that representation is on a person-to-person basis, not on the basis of color. Certainly, we need more broad representation on the basis of color in our legislative leadership, in our executive leadership, in our business leadership, for that matter. I think we can always do a better job with that. I don't think I would go so far as to call that taxation without representation, but by that I do not mean to minimize the fact that we do lack the kind of representation that we should have in our mature institutions.
And I would add to that, it's tremendously frustrating. In the campaign work that we've engaged in, we have done a very strong effort to recruit candidates of color. I think Oregon should be proud of the fact that we have women in key leadership positions in the legislature and as the governor as well, far beyond most any other state. But in terms of people of color, I mean, Lou Frederick is the one African-American representative in the Oregon House. And the difficulty we're running into, both for everything from school boards to city councils, county commissioners, legislature, is the fact that we have income inequality in our country that's such a wide divide. It's mostly old white guys who have some ability or resources who can run for the legislature. Legislators get paid $22,000 a year, and you're gone from home constantly, you're gone from work constantly. How can somebody with a young family who is trying to get a toehold in their community and build their career, how can they take on that job or take on a city council job or a school board job?
Thank you both so much. At this point, we will move on to the question portion, and we've actually invited two experts to ask questions today. And at this point, I'd like to invite our first expert, John Taponia, who is the president of Eco Northwest, a firm focusing on economics and finance, to begin our question session.
All right, thank you. And first, some credit to these two individuals. I'd say they governed during some of the toughest fiscal times in Oregon's history, and they can still complete full sentences. So thank you for your service. Representative Buckley, I'm going to return to a point that you brought up early, which is PERS, and this session was titled Overspending or Undertaxing. PERS is clearly an area that over the course of the next 2 decades, we are unambiguously going to overspend. The actuary has predicted that for school districts, and this is not isolated to school districts, but for school districts, the share of their payrolls that they're going to have to contribute to PERS will start at the 20% today and gradually ratchet up to 30% over the course of the next decade. That means that spending per student on PERS will gradually ratchet up from a little bit under $1,000 per student to $1,600 per student, and that's adjusted for inflation. In 2011, the City Club of Portland wrote a 43-page remarkable report on this topic. It had 7 key recommendations at the end of it. The Oregon legislature passed one of them, the out-of-state tax remedy, but 6 have been left unaddressed and not seriously considered. So my question is this: is it appropriate at this point in time to ask taxpayers for a large tax increase without any significant serious consideration of the other 6 recommendations in the City Club PERS report?
Thanks for the question. I read the report. We pored over it. When we were working on trying to deal with what then current PERS issue in 2013, we spent countless hours going through every suggestion that we could, getting the best legal advice as we could as what was believed the Supreme Court may or may not be willing to even entertain. Some of the suggestions in the City Club report we were advised by the legal folks we were working with were not going to be workable. Anything, I think the court has been very clear, anything going backwards, anything touching a retiree, the court was very clear in its decision last year, is off limits. They're not going to entertain a reduction of a benefit that a retiree was contracted for while they were working. Going forward, anything that does affect the system going forward is definitely fair game and definitely needs to be focused on in 2017. In addition, I think some out-of-the-box thinking has to happen, as well as perhaps capping the rates for school districts and local government, finding a way to make the additional PERS costs part of the state budget, because I think it's the state's responsibility for what's happened with PERS for the most part. So the work has to get done on that. Before I leave office, that's one thing I want to continue to do for the next 8 months or so, is try to focus on what I can offer to the 2017 legislature as a legacy. As I say goodbye and go back to live in heaven, they get to wrestle with PERS on that one.
Did you want to add anything?
No, I really don't have much to add, except to say that, of course, in 2003, we did some pretty heavy lifting on PERS reform. Former Representative MACPHERSON remembers those battles well. I guess I could say that things could be worse if we had not made those amendments in 2003. It is fraught with legal challenge, but I do agree with the premise of your question, John, that if we're going to be asking taxpayers to increase revenue, that is one of the structural aspects of state government that we need to address to show that we're being serious on that side of the ledger as well.
Thank you. So our next expert, Reed Scott Schwalbach, teaches Spanish at Centennial High School and is a board member for the National Education Association.
Thank you. My name is Reed Scott Schwalbach, and I've been teaching Spanish at Centennial High School for the past 17 years. And something that was said earlier resonated with me about how hard it is to be a state legislator, because my first year teaching, my take-home pay was only $22,000. So things have changed a lot since I started teaching, and one of the things that has changed in addition to our salary structure is that our conversations around the lunch table are about different things than they were when I first started teaching. So for example, yesterday, one of my colleagues was telling me about the increase in violence in our elementary students and how every single one of the women who work with her have had dislocated thumbs because of the students they're working. So education has changed, and there is a certain degree of desperation now as we are looking at what we could be faced with if we don't have an increase in revenue. And I'm working with my colleagues and other working families across the state on IP 28. So we'd like to hear from you, from my colleagues and from my students, how will things look different if this measure passes?
Representative Shetterly, can you
Sure.
start it? And we are running out of time, so we can keep it short.
It's hard for me to say how things will look different if IP 28 passes. I haven't seen an analysis of it, other than that I know what its rate is, that it taxes gross receipts of about 1,000 corporations, C corporations. Legislative Revenue Office suggests that about half of those will, 100 of those will pay about half the tax. And it raises, I think, about $5 billion. So that's a lot of money. What concerns me about it is that it does not address the structural aspect of our revenue system. That means once we spend up to that level of new revenue, we're still on the same roller coaster that we're riding today. We're depending on basically 1,000 C corporations, 100 of them to pay half of that to carry us through from biennium to biennium. And guess what? There are recessions ahead that are going to affect the stability of that revenue. So we're still going to have the ups and downs that we already experience, only they're going to be even greater because the size of the pie is going to be greater. The size of the roller coaster is going to be greater. So my concern about that is that it does not address the issue of stability in our revenue system that I mentioned in my first comments, but in fact it could exacerbate the problem of instability by tying that revenue to that very small base. It's a lot of eggs in a small basket.
So to answer that question, I think we would be an entirely different state. We would finally be addressing Measure 5, the mistakes and choices of Measure 5, and the mistakes and choices around PERS. We would resolve those issues finally that have been hanging around our necks for 25 years. We put 10% of that revenue into reserves so we can have the sort of stability that Lane's talking about that we absolutely need. We could fund K-12 at the quality education model levels. And my school district of Ashland is fairly close to that QEM compared to other districts, and you can see that model works. I had a student come to my office several years back from Rogue Community College. She sat across from me at my desk and she said, every year I've been in school, all I've known is less. And that has to change. So with something on the scale of IP28, we would be a different state. We'd have PE, music, the arts in all of our schools. We'd start bringing down tuition in our community colleges and higher ed. We could double our investment in early childhood education and the programs for seniors and people with disabilities. We could have a mental health system that actually functions we could be proud of. We could raise our judges' salaries so maybe they're like, 40th in the nation. We could actually have a functioning state budget. We could actually have a stable state budget, and we could have a totally different future to offer to our kids and our grandkids.
So, thank you both. Thank you to our experts as well, and we will make time for questions from the audience a little later in our program. So let's dig down a little bit more on this particular topic. There's something that I find a little bit confusing when we talk about IP28, or really any more taxes in this area, which is the business community has supported a sales tax for quite some time. There are also many experts who contend that a gross receipts tax functions a lot like a sales tax. Why are business leaders for a retail sales tax and against this?
So all I can say, I can't say what's in the minds of business leaders. There are many here, and they can speak to this. I think that the idea that it's kind of a hidden sales tax is not correct. Prices can be adjusted by large corporations, and their shareholders could actually receive less and deal with some of the balance that way. Prices can be spread out in multi-state corporations to their entire franchises nationwide. So it's not a direct tie like that. The two problems with the sales tax in comparison, a sales tax is regressive, even if you do not impose it on food and medicine, it's still a regressive tax. And the political reality of it, it's been tried in Oregon 9 times and turned down 9 times. Most famously, at least in my lifetime, is Governor Barbara Roberts putting her entire governorship on the line to pass a sales tax for education, and the voters turned it down vehemently.
Well, like Peter, I can't speak for business. I'm a country lawyer. But I think one of the concerns that I would have from that perspective is, again, IP28 is a very narrow tax, again, aimed at, it sounds like 1,000 corporations. That number comes from the Legislative Revenue Office, 1,000 C corporations, where the business has supported a sales tax. One of the things you have there is it's a broad base. It lends stability to the revenue system that we're not going to get out of IP28. It provides for the diversification of the revenue system that we're not going to get out of IP28. To me, that's the structural concern, and I'm sure business has other concerns as well, one of which being we now have to look not just at the revenue, what does it raise, and also recognizing that it doesn't address the stability issues in our system, but then what are the consequences in employment, and in the feedback of a tax like IP28, and the very concerns, I think, as we see the analyses come out, that it will have a negative impact on private employment in the state, and make things more difficult for the business sector to thrive. And that is the sector that we need to depend on, of course, if we're going to be raising money out of IP28. It's a loop that I think doesn't quite complete itself.
So Senator Mark Hass has been working on a compromise. He's been really honest that it's highly unlikely it won't pass this session, but if he makes progress and has some traction, it could warrant maybe a special session. What kind of compromise would you like to see that actually has a chance of passing?
Oh, when you put it that way. I'm actually intrigued by the senator's proposal. It is, again, in contrast to IB28, it is a broad-based gross receipts tax. And so with that broader base would be a more stable source of revenue. I haven't seen the specific analysis of it yet, but I'm intrigued by it. What I think has to happen in order, in my mind, one of the other criteria that I'd like to see for a reform measure is one that has political buy-in from a broad spectrum. When we did the recommendations coming out of the Task Force on Revenue Restructuring, we had a consensus of business and labor groups on the primary recommendation of kicker reform to create a reserve fund. Coming out of that session, the legislature instead adopted the tax increases that became Measure 66 and 67, instead of addressing the kicker reform, instead of addressing the structural issues. And my concern is that that created a real rift between business and labor on the issues of revenue in Oregon that I think we're still seeing the effects of. I would like to think that a broader-based tax, something like Senator Hass's, if that's the case, would garner more broad-based support because it is more structural and less impactful of any particular sector of the business economy, but again, broader. I'm very interested to see how that works out.
So my concerns with the proposal is it doesn't address the structural deficiencies that I started my talk here with. It does not answer the Measure 5 challenge and problem we've given ourselves. It doesn't answer the PERS challenge that we've given ourselves. It does not bring in the revenue needed to get anywhere close to the quality education model. It does not bring in the revenue needed to get anywhere close to our ability to invest more in higher education and bring down the cost of higher education, bring down that debt load on our kids. So that's my concern with that proposal. I appreciate the senator bringing something forward. My I guess hair on fire part of this is that for 25 years we've tried to figure this out and we haven't done it. If there is a better proposal that can hit those priorities of actually giving us a stable and adequate state budget for the investments that we need, that can actually get the support of Oregonians, then please bring it forward. I would love to see someone bring it forward, but right now the only proposal out there is IP28 that does hit the Measure 5 deficiency, that does hit the PERS deficiency, that does get us to the quality education model level, that does get us the higher education investment, that does stabilize the budget. That's the only proposal I've seen that does it. If there's another one, I'm totally wide open to it.
Thank you both. So last question before we go to larger audience questions. So you have both voted to cut public programs and you have both voted to increase taxes. Can you share a story or an experience about a time that you have had to cut something that was the most painful for you personally or professionally, and what that has helped you to learn and understand about Oregon and our tax structure?
Well, I have a couple dozen of them, and I'm sure my former co-chair Richardson has a dozen of the stories too from the 2011 session. But the hardest for me is cutting the programs for people with developmental disabilities. When we're in the 2009 session, 2011 session, when you have families sit across the table from you and let you know what that impact's going to be on their families. I've never experienced anything quite like that, and I hope I never experience anything like that again. I can't remember what the second part of your question was.
What you've learned, but
Okay. Well, what I learned is that, you know, the one thing about the budget work is it's amazing to me is that it's so tied together that if you cut a program like for a child with autism, it not only affects that child and their family, but it affects their school as well, because that child's not getting services outside of school. The school is impacted by the child's needs at school. If you don't fund the in-home care program for seniors, those seniors would move to a higher cost institution. It's all tied together. If you don't fund the judicial system adequately, things don't get processed both in the criminal side and the civil side, and that has an impact on society. So the major thing I've learned is how tied together every piece of the budget is, and how careful you have to be, both when you build it and both when you cut it.
Thank you.
Well, I'm a survivor of 2002, and those of you who are around remember that was the year we had 5 special sessions, because at the end of 2001, we returned a kicker of over $1 billion. At the end of 2001, the bottom fell out of the economy after we had passed the budget. And 2002 was a series of declining revenue forecasts that brought us back in to make more cuts, more cuts, more cuts, 5 special sessions. So I learned a lot in those. What I learned was the danger of the instability of our system, that just more revenue does not solve the problem, because we will still be riding that path down if we don't address the stability of the system through a broadly diversified revenue base.
Thank you so much. At this point, we'll be moving to invite audience members to ask questions. Please remember that asking questions is a benefit of membership of City Club, and we invite members to ask questions, and please know that membership is open to everyone. I'll also remind our listeners that today we are speaking with Representative Lane Shetterly and Representative Peter Buckley. My name is Nicole Maher, and we are talking about taxes today. So let's invite our first question from our first City Club member.
Thank you. My name is Chuck Sheketoff. I'm with the Oregon Center for Public Policy and a City Club member. I want to thank you both for being here. I'm one of the members of the lobby that's been trying to figure out how to clone folks like you before you leave. I want to talk about and ask a question about 2 examples of misguided budget, the intersection of 2 misguided budget and tax policies, and whether you agree they're misguided and what we can do about it. And the common denominator in the 2 examples is rich. Oregon gives the Knight family a subsidy for making films at a studio they built and have here in Oregon of millions of dollars over the years in our film subsidy program. At the same time, which is funded by a tax credit. At the same time, a woman who flees an abusive person with 2 young children and comes to the state wanting a little bit of cash assistance and job training, get back into the workforce, is denied access to that system because she works 2 days a week, and at 2 days a week, she's considered too rich to even get in the door of the Temporary Assistance to Needy Families program. Do you agree that those are misguided policies, and what should we do to change our budget priorities?
I do agree those are misguided priorities. Again, I have to go back to how everything is tied together. If you talk about the film and video tax credit, I'm not a huge fan of tax credit. I'm not a huge fan of like government pushing in here, pushing in there, but when there is a proven track record, for instance, in Southern Oregon, the film and video tax credit has created jobs. You can see the line directly to it of the film and video independent companies in Southern Oregon. So I can defend that one. I can say, yes, I can see how that's working. As you can probably imagine, I can't see the moral path to denying service or assistance to someone who's working hard and trying desperately to take care of her family. And everything I think we've done, we tried to do in the state budget in the past stretch of time, and probably forever, is to try to address those needs in the most creative, intelligent way we possibly can, knowing that we are going to fall short, and we have.
Next question, please.
Barbara Gordon-Lickey, City Club member. I was wondering to what extent you think the kicker contributes to the instability, and whether you think, if you think it is a significant matter, whether you think anything can be done about it.
The kicker contributes hugely to the instability. I mentioned a minute ago about in 2001, how we returned about $1 billion in the kicker just as we were going into a recession. And a year later, we were back in 5 special sessions cutting the budget because we did not have the revenue to meet the budget we had approved in the spring the year before. So it's huge impact. And that was why it was the #1 recommendation of the Task Force on Comprehensive Revenue Restructuring. Given that we have such an unstable revenue system, dependent as we are on the income tax, the volatile income tax, using kicker reform to capture some of that money that otherwise would go back in kicker, to invest that in an adequate reserve fund to create virtual stability that you would otherwise get in a diversified system. That we saw as the most achievable reform. Again, what happened in that session, we came out with a recommendation, a consensus of business and labor members on the task force. The legislature had a different agenda. That got left on the cutting room floor, to go back to Chuck's question. And really, I think ever since then, that moment, that Camelot moment, I think when we had everybody at the table at the same place, really has been lost. We've not been able to restore that. I'm hopeful that someday we'll get back there.
So if I can respond very quickly, Lane's entirely right. And also we sent out over $1 billion in the kicker in 2007, right before the Great Recession hit. If those dollars could have been in reserve, we would have been in so much better shape. The kicker also keeps us to having the highest bond rating, the AAA bond rating. We have a AA plus bond rating, the second best bond rating. The only reason we don't have AAA is because of the kicker. That's what the bonding folks tell us consistently. The problem, I would disagree slightly with what Lane said, in that it wasn't on the legislature agenda. We couldn't get the votes for it. We couldn't get the votes to change the kicker, to refer the kicker law out to the ballot. It's something that's been a frustration. We tried again in the 2015 session. We couldn't get the votes for it. So I think until Oregonians demand that to happen, the legislature's not going to act on it, because it does have to be referred out to the voters. It's in our Constitution. And unfortunately, when I do town halls, et cetera, people believe that the kicker, they don't quite get it. I believe most people don't quite get it. They think what the kicker means is they personally paid too much money and they're getting a refund back. So if we ask to pull back the kicker, they believe that we're saying we're taking their money. Instead, what the kicker actually is the estimate from the state economist on the revenue that's going to come in, and the revenue is over 2% above what he said was going to come in, and so everything kicks back. I share my colleagues' frustration with Oregon's kicker law.
Nicole, if I may, $1 billion returned before the 2001 recession, $1 billion returned before the Great Recession in 2007. I think we're returning about $400 million this year. Let's hope that history is not repeating itself.
Thanks, Lane.
So I'm going to read one of the questions I've received from a note card. How will the tax increase affect people who make lower wages and can't make ends meet as it is? And I think they're referring to IP 28.
So there's some confusion, I think, with the Oregonians' coverage of this when they talked about, let's say, revenue and analysis of gross receipts tax, but that wasn't IP 28. It was a different proposal that had a 4% gross receipt tax on all small business, all business in Oregon. I believe that's what it was. So there's some confusion there on that. So I hope people understand when they look at these different proposals that they actually get the accurate data on which proposal is being discussed. In answer to this question, I could see an impact on this. For instance, if one of the corporations is Target, department stores, it is possible that they will adjust their prices up because of the additional gross receipts tax they have to pay on sales over $25 million in the state of Oregon. So I weigh that and I look at that and say, you know, my family, we're a middle-class family. Our neighborhood is a fair to middle-class neighborhood. We might end up paying a little bit more when we go to Target, so will people who have less income than we do. But in exchange for that, there is an education system that serves their kids and gives their kids all the opportunities that I had growing up. And to me, I'll make that exchange any day of the week.
Nicole, again, we haven't seen the impact analysis of IP 28. I haven't anyway, so it's really hard to say, except again, just going back to the basic notion that that tax increase will be passed through either in prices. It could be passed through in compensation paid to employees, who would be Oregonian, could be Oregonians affected that way, and it could be passed through by lower dividends to shareholders. And I'm not sure, but I would imagine PERS is probably invested in Target or something like that, or some of the other businesses that would be affected by it. So the scope of the impact, I don't know. I'm in the dark on that, but I think there will be an impact. That's just an economic reality.
And their follow-up question was really, what happens to education, healthcare, and senior care if we don't approve IP 28?
Well, I'll jump in first. I feel a certain amount of guilt leaving the legislature heading towards the 2017 session, because I'm going to leave to my successor, if there is no additional revenue, a situation where pretty much we're looking at cuts across the board again, even though the economy is doing as well as it ever does in the state of Oregon. It's the best of times in terms of how the economy is coming back, but on the state budget, because of the PERS costs and because of the Affordable Care Act increase on the state budget, we have no way to get to even a current service level budget of what we're funding our schools at now. I mean, we might be able to squeeze a little bit more, like $100 million more into the state school fund, but school districts will be making layoffs again, they're making cuts again. Human services, we're already under investing in human services. The foster system's been in the news a lot recently, and the director of the division got a lot of attention when asked directly, can you guarantee that all kids in the system are safe? And she said no. One reason is that we're funding the caseload model, which is a nationally recognized model for how many caseworkers, frontline workers you need per kid. We're underfunding that by about 15%. So that's why there's the gaps in the foster care system. There'll be more gaps in human services without additional revenue. In terms of public safety, we will be stressed as far as you can possibly imagine, just holding that system together again. I would see somewhere in the neighborhood of a 5% cut from what the current service level funding is in the state budget in 2017.
And I can't disagree with Peter in terms of the immediate impact, and it's not good. It is not good. I don't think there's anyone here in the room that would be satisfied with it. It's dire. That said, desperate times don't always call for desperate measures. Sometimes they call for thoughtful measures. My concern, again, with IP 28 will be flush in that initial uptick in revenue. We'll feel pretty good, but we're still riding the roller coaster, which means that when that next recession comes, the slide will be fast, and it will be far, and it will be steep, and we will be facing cuts again from a different level, but still cuts. And that's the consequence of not addressing a structural reform, but really tacking on a very narrow cast tax increase to a narrow slice of taxpayers, and relying on them to see us through, not just in the next biennium, but the biennium after that and the biennium after that. And I don't think it gets us there. I'm afraid it makes false promises.
Add on, it's funny because it's a revenue guy and a budget guy, so just a little bit different perspective. I see the ability for the state finally to build the reserves. We've tried very hard to build the rainy day fund. The Education Stability Fund is filled kind of automatically from the lottery, but we've tried very hard. If I was going to be in a position with that sort of revenue coming in, I would tell my colleagues the first thing we have to do is we have to build the rainy day fund up so that it is somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 to 10% of the general fund lottery fund budget, so that we hit that next downturn, we actually would have the ability to try to surf through it.
I wish I could be as sanguine as that as far as the reserve fund. My concern about that is I doubt that even with the level of funding of IP 28, that the legislature is going to get notes from people saying, thanks, we've got what we need. My fear is that the pressure will still be there to spend the revenue that's available, and that makes it very hard as a legislator. I know, because then you're facing the people who need that money. It's there. The pressure to spend that is so great. I wish I could be as sanguine about that reserve fund.
That concludes our portion for questions. Thank you for those who asked questions, and we certainly apologize to the many of you who wanted to, and for the audience members who submitted. If I could invite each of you to give us a closing remark in less than 1 minute, we would love to hear your thoughts to close out today's event.
Well, I'll start with the closing since Lane started with the opening. I'll be very quick. I'll just say thank you. Thank you for the time consideration. It's a privilege to work on behalf of people in the legislature. We took the Ways and Means Committee around the state every 2 years around the state. We're an incredibly resilient state. We're an incredibly creative state. We have remarkable communities in the state of Oregon. I have full faith that we'll be able to figure it out. But my message here today is we have to figure it out. We have to address those structural deficits. We owe it to our kids and our grandkids, and we have to get it done. Thanks.
Thanks, and thanks again for the invitation to be here. It's been a lot of fun, and to be up here with Peter and talking about budget and revenue. Isn't that great fun? It's just great stuff. That would get me to come to Portland. I guess what I would say is that really and truly, what we need is not just new revenue. It's not a question of what we need, but how we get it. And how we get it for the long term is so critical that it be done in a way that is both economically stable but also politically stable, so that we have some ability to predict in the years to come where we're going to be, so that we can budget, so that companies can invest and grow. And that's my takeaway, that we need that stability as well as our revenue.
We're out of broadcast time. This is Greg McPherson, President of City Club. Please join me in thanking our guests, as well as Mary Nolan and Sam Metz of the Friday Forum Committee, who produced today's program. We're adjourned.